Hi gang, in Warhammer 40k, a world of insane honour duels, heroic last stands and colossal fistfights, it can be pretty uncommon to find a faction that just seem a bit more sensible. But to the Space Marines of the Raptors chapter, inured to loss and hardship, and possibly at least one complete refounding in their 10,000-year history, pragmatism and professionalism are the rare order of the day. The Raptors are a chapter unlike many others in the galaxy of Warhammer 40k in that they, almost uniquely for Space Marines, actually behave like professional soldiers. Experts in hit and run and guerrilla warfare, the Raptors' independent void-faring companies approach warfare like a puzzle to be solved, applying their often small numbers at the point where they can cause maximum damage to their enemies for the minimum loss of Astartes' life, frequently operating far behind enemy lines for years at a time to slowly influence the outcome of battlefronts to the Imperium's advantage. But this pragmatic nature has seen them looked upon with some suspicion by an Imperium that often prefers bombastic mass warfare, a secretive chapter who've been brought to the brink of destruction many times and whose early years are lost to Imperial record. The Raptors chapter has developed a reputation for sometimes dangerous levels of independence. The history of the Raptors chapter is long and confusing and marred by both loss and the presence of ancient and fragmented tales that date all the way back to the Horus Heresy. The Raptors are one of the few second founding successor chapters of the Raven Guard Legion. During the Wars of the Heresy, the Raven Guard were one of the most heavily reduced of all the Loyalist Space Marine legions. They lost much of their number during the drop site massacre on Istvan V at the outset of the Heresy, and despite attempts to rebuild their numbers, which we'll get to in a minute, they were still heavily below strength by the end of the war. According to apocryphal records, now mostly lost to the vagaries of time, the Astartes that would make up the original Raptors chapter were initiates training on the Raven Guard homeworld of Deliverance at the time of the drop site massacre and spared much of the heresy, fought together as a company with distinction during the Wars of the Scouring that followed, as the traitor legions were hunted down and hounded into the Eye of Terror. When Roboute Guilliman instituted his reforms to the old Space Marine legions, breaking them down into individual chapters, this roving company was granted the honour of chapter status. At least, that's the story that can be pieced together from existing records. But the name Raptors also has other uses in the Raven Guard. After the near destruction of his legion on Istvan, the Primarch of the Raven Guard, Corvus Corax, using genetic material from the Primarch project that was gifted to him by the Emperor, attempted to rebuild his legion as quickly as possible. After much experimentation, the apothecaries of the Raven Guard managed to utilise the genetic samples to raise new Astartes much faster than previously possible. These new Astartes were a form of inductii, a term used for the many ways that the legions attempted to accelerate Astartes production during the heresy, but the Raven Guard inductii were a major improvement, significantly faster and stronger than other Space Marines. The first units to be implanted using the new methods were trained on Deliverance shortly after the drop site massacre and were quickly given the name Raptors after their first successful assault on a word-bearer's fortress. However, the project was later sabotaged by the Alpha Legion, who corrupted those core genetic samples with a warp-borne disease, and later inductions of the Raptors were horrifically mutated. Though they were still loyal Raven Guard, their bodies were so twisted barely 1 in 100 could even hold a bolt gun. As a result, Corax's plans to hothouse Astartes and rebuild his legion were put aside, but But the twisted Astartes recruits continued to fight alongside Raven Guard forces throughout the war. A dark and shameful secret the Raven Guard would deploy to the most intense conflicts. What happened to those original Raptors is unknown. In one version of events, Corax personally granted each of the twisted warriors the Emperor's mercy before he disappeared into the warp during the Scouring, leaving none alive. In another, the fate of the Raptors came to a head during the Battle of Yarant, when the Raven Guard fought alongside the Space Wolves Legion and the Raptors were discovered by a company of the Sixth. The Raptors, fearing persecution for their Primarch, slaughtered their allies and then expected to be sentenced to death in turn, but at least a few were spared by Corax, and what happened to them after that, nobody knows. Of course, the story of those original Raptors is largely unknown to the rest of the Imperium and may have had no connection to the Raptors chapter. The Adeptus Astartes are famously bad at coming up with new terms for their units. Since so much of the chapter's history is lost, it's hard to say either way. Whoever they were, it's known that the early Raptors chapter, sometimes listed as the Raptor Legion, were a fleet-based force until a few centuries into the new Imperium, at which point they were granted a homeworld near the Eye of Terror, one of many chapters posted to serve as a bulwark against chaos incursions. There are records of the Raptors serving as the base for the Ring of Steel constructed around the world of Origo in M36, a world that was scoured clean of life, and they're also listed as siring successor chapters that same millennium, but which chapters those might be is also lost. And then, during the 37th millennium, around the time of Abaddon the Despoiler's 4th or 5th Black Crusades, the entire chapter was listed as destroyed in action, along with the loss of their homeworld. There then follows a period of almost 2,000 years where no records exist of the chapter until the 39th millennium, when the Raptors appeared in Imperial records again, this time at full chapter strength and fighting in the Caberiad Wars. And it's this version of the chapter that persists in the records to this day, their companies having come to the swift aid of Imperial forces across the galaxy ever since. Much like their progenitors in the Raven Guard, the Raptors are a pragmatic chapter. They're Codex compliant, but they view the Codex as a proven and effective set of military strategies rather than blind dogma to be followed without question. As a chapter that have been brought to the edge of destruction many times, they have little regard for individual honor or flamboyant displays of combat prowess, instead focusing on achieving their objectives in the most effective and efficient manner with the fewest resources and Astartes' lives expended as possible. As of the 39th millennium, their homeworld is listed as a planet named Tarangast, located somewhere in the Sutter's Spiral Nebula in the north of the Segmentum Solar, though they recruit from numerous other worlds in the area, including Numina, Ra, and Badwater. After that brush with extinction, the chapter are loath to reveal the exact location of either their recruitment base or their fortress monastery, known only as Prime. Wherever it is, the number of Astartes on station is likely very few, as their companies are all highly independent, active in small war fleets across the Imperium, and only coming together when dire need arises. This pragmatic nature and their tendency to fight in individual companies have led the Raptors to favour meticulously planned hit-and-run style warfare. Experts in infiltration, guerrilla tactics, and ambushes, the Raptors make heavy use of their scout company, an extensive land speeder and bike pool, as reconnaissance units, seeking to locate the tipping point of the enemy forces where the heavier elements of the chapter can be deployed in a surgical strike for maximum effectiveness. The Battle Brothers of the Raptors, unlike many Space Marines, eschew close combat unless totally necessary. It's unclear if this is a trait lent by their gene seed, but clean kill from afar is considered much more efficient, and the chapter has a reputation for having some of the finest marksmen in the Imperium, even by the standard of the Space Marines. This has occasionally led to accusations of cowardice by more traditionally minded chapters, which the Raptors usually ignore, considering those orthodox chapters to be blind adherents to tradition. Within their command structure, unthinking obedience is strongly discouraged and independent thought praised. The Raptors' company captains undertake lengthy training in battlefield tactics and strategic prioritization, and are always willing to embrace unique and unorthodox tactics tactics, and the chapter frequently works in concert with other Imperial military forces. They'll often liaise closely with other forces in the area to form the ad hoc scratch units and strike teams that are best suited to each mission, even deploying individual battle brothers amongst their allies to advise on deployment and tactics. The Raptors are even willing to take command of other Imperial military assets when they deem it necessary, though this has been regarded with some suspicion in the halls of terror. Though their standard colour scheme is a dull olive green, the chapter frequently makes heavy use of an array of codex-compliant or warzone-specific camouflage schemes. Whatever their original origin, their gene seed is healthy and stable and exhibits the usual Raven Guard markers, including the lack of a mucranoid organ and the tendency for the Battle Brothers' skin to grow paler and their hair to grow darker over time. Unlike their progenitors, though, they retain a functional Betcher's gland, the organ that allows Space Marines to synthesize and spit acid. It's unknown if they somehow reintegrated this organ into their development process, or if they merely separated from the parent Legion before that organ fell out of use. However, though the Battle Brothers of the Legion are genetically stable and often present as professional, if taciturn, to outsiders, there exists a marked tendency within the chapter towards fatalism. The numerous times their chapter has almost been wiped out can manifest in black moods and an obsession with death, the afflicted Battle Brother starting to see death as a dark inevitability, little concerned with the honour of sacrifice, and potentially casting doubt on otherwise functional plans. In extreme cases, their Battle Brothers might become reckless, potentially endangering themselves or their squad, or overly focused on potential problems and dangers to a level that might compromise tactical command, though thankfully such extremes are quite rare. Since their most recent return to the Imperium, the companies of the Raptors have been active across the galaxy. Soon after their reappearance, a task force of the chapter participated in the Sancta Angelis campaign of early M39, a single company engaging in a 30-year guerrilla war against the Orcs of War Irongol. Operating behind enemy lines, the task force struck at a number of Orc worlds, turning the leadership of the War against each other and causing internal battles and division, all the while scavenging the supplies they needed to keep operating. This eventually led to the task force isolating Irongol in the sulfur oxide deserts of Bantax, where the entire task force concentrated their might to wipe out the war boss and his mega-armored bodyguard, which then broke the threat of the war as it devolved into a storm of infighting. They fought alongside the Red Scorpions in the Endicon campaign against Eldari Reavers, and through a careful hit-and-run campaign, they drew away Eldari forces, eventually becoming victorious, and this was despite a suicidal drop pod assault by the Red Scorpions on Endikion 9 that resulted in the Scorpions losing much of their number. They were also instrumental in breaking the 4th Quadrant Rebellion in the 700s M41, a series of brushfire conflicts and rebellions that engulfed almost a quarter of the Segmentum Solar after years of misrule by tyrannical Imperial commanders. Of course, these rebellions were then bolstered by opportunistic Xenos and Chaos cultists until a dozen Space Marine chapters were in some way involved. The Raptors were brought in at full chapter strength alongside the Dark Angels, Skull Bearers and Red Wolves to bring order to the quadrant, and directed their efforts towards the swift ending of the rebellion in the Sulsalid subsector, a particularly important issue as that sector had embraced the horrific and virulent philosophies of progress and democracy. Seeking a swift end before such horrible ideas spread to other sectors, the Raptors took command of a number of Imperial Guard task forces that had been defeated by the Sulsalid and redirected their attacks to cover the covert strikes of the chapter. The Raptors struck at their supply lines and disabled their power grids, allowing the Imperial Guard to advance through the sector before delivering the final blow against the Sulsalid sky palaces with their jump troops and Thunderhawks. The Raptors chapter involved themselves in the Badab War in 906 M41, arriving in the Maelstrom Zone in force, along with many other chapters, in response to the call for aid submitted by the Inquisition. Their 2nd, 5th and 6th companies, led by their chapter master, Laius Isidon, arrived on their battle barge War Talon, accompanied by 2 strike cruisers and 10 Gladius-class frigates. Initially, Isidon, a consummate strategist, offered himself up for overall command of the Loyalist forces, but the grim and taciturn commander was passed over in favour of the Red Scorpions commander, Verin Ortis. In keeping with their pragmatic mindset, the Raptors happily fell into line, forging a surprising bond with the Red Scorpions over the course of the campaign, despite the two chapters being practically opposites in both character and beliefs. The Raptors initially formed a mobile reserve, moving across many of the early front lines of the war, their fleet elements quickly proving to be the terror of the secessionists. Early on, they were instrumental in Operation Sedna, the covert mission to liberate the planet of Cerngrad for the Loyalists. The northern polar defense fortress was unassailable from the void, studded with defense lasers and garrisoned by a company-strong force of astral claws. The Raptors launched a string of diversionary attacks in the planet's equatorial zone, using these as a cover to land 200 Marines in field-modified armor over 300 kilometers away from the fortress with only man-portable support. Those infiltrators then spent the next 3 weeks slowly advancing on the Astral Claw's position under the cover of the regular blizzards and electrical storms of the area, arriving at the fortress undetected and storming the walls in a surprise attack. Though casualties were relatively high, the polar guns were silenced, allowing the Raptors and their Salamander allies to land heavy assault elements and take the planet. For the next year or so, the Raptors were everywhere, in particular fighting the Astral Claws and Mantis warriors through the brutal jungles of Gargathia. The Raptors were some of the only loyalist forces who could match the Mantis warriors ambush for ambush. But by midway through the war, these extensive engagements had taken their toll. The Raptors task force took losses of between 30 and 60% in those early years, as well as suffering the destruction of a strike cruiser over Gargathia and serious damage to the War Talon during Operation Sedna. And in 908, the Raptors were officially given their withdrawal orders. However, many suspected their early withdrawal was in part due to the distrust of the Legate Inquisitor Frayne, in command of prosecuting the war, and who was openly suspicious of the secretive chapter, and a small Raptors force actually stayed in the Maelstrom Zone way longer, acting on their own initiative. The Raptors continued to spread their task forces across the Imperium in the years that followed Bad Ab, contributing to many of the more famous campaigns of the era. In 998 M41, they were one of the many chapters who fought in the Third War for Armageddon against the Orcs of Gazgul Thraka. The Raptors deployed into the planet's equatorial jungles, fighting a guerrilla war against the Orcs alongside the Armageddon Orc Hunter regiments and the Catachan jungle fighters. And the same year, a task force of Raptors accompanied the hastily organized Imperial fleet dispatched to the world of Taros to reclaim it from the invading Tau Empire. The Raptors led the initial assault on the planet, their Thunderhawk gunships completing a surprise orbital insertion, clearing the Tau missile defenses, and securing the landing zones required by the 4,621st Astra Militarum army before returning to orbit. Though the campaign was a failure in the end, the army underprepared for the unforgiving climate of the planet, the small Raptors force was instrumental in rescuing the remnants of the Imperial Guard deployed to the planet. The Marines bravely held the original landing zone against a major Tau counterattack, while the army's Talon and Elysian forces struggled to escape the planet. And later, after the arrival of torchbearer fleets bearing the technology required to create Primaris Marines, the Raptors fought as part of the Indomitus Crusade, with elements of the chapter spread across fleets Primus, Secundus, and Tertius. The Raptors are another interesting chapter in the Bad Ab War, one that has been written to be as different as it's possible to be from many of the more famous chapters involved. For Space Marines, they're almost sensible, a strangely believable army for Warhammer 40k. This was all an invention of the Forge World Bad Ab books. The chapter had always been listed as part of the Bad Ab War since back in the 80s when they were referred to as the Raptor Legion. The Bad Ab War predates the idea of Space Marine Legions, the Second Founding and the Horus Heresy, so there were a few chapters who just happened to be called Legions back in those days. Back then, they rocked this incredibly bright yellow and blue colour scheme, as well as a couple of camo options, and this colour scheme persisted through the 90s when they would occasionally pop up in lists of Space Marine chapters. They even retained that colour scheme as far as How to Paint Space Marines in 2004, which is weird because their rebranding as green drab-clad infiltrators actually came 4 years before that, during the Third War for Armageddon campaign in 2000. In the backstory for that, the Raptors were given a definite history as a Raven Guard successor who specialized in surgical strikes and jungle warfare, and then this color scheme was carried on into the Imperial armor books. They've got a number of color plates and vehicle drawings featured in the very early books, when the series was just a list of vehicles you could take, and they appeared in the very first campaign book, Taros, in 2005. And then, from that point, their development was largely handled within Forge World, all the way up to the Badab War. And because of that, they follow the format of many Badab War chapters. Very clearly a successor of the Raven Guard, but rather than just including a first founding chapter in this fringe conflict, the Raptors are a way of taking all those normal Raven Guard traits, pragmatic, sneaky, striking from the shadows, and using them in a bit of a different way. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to hear more about the chapters of the Badab War and the rest of the 41st Millennium, there's a little video popping up there to the right. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can like and subscribe, or there are links to the YouTube membership scheme or the Patreon in the thing below. See ya!